Hi everyone, Master P here from the Language of Composition 3rd edition. We're here for another close reading video, and today we're taking a look at an excerpt from Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. So whenever we read closely, we know that we are trying to read actively. We're engaging in the text, not only mentally, but physically. We're writing with it, we're thinking about it. We're really trying to reveal those layers of meaning and also gain a better understanding of the strategies and tools and techniques a writer uses to make his or her argument and to develop a position. So the tools that we need would include our copies of the Language of Composition 3rd edition, our key passage handouts, highlighters are helpful, and obviously something to write with like a pen or a pencil. So we always start by thinking about the rhetorical situation. We think about how a text is shaped by its subject matter, its speaker, and its audience. And then we also go beyond those traditional elements of the rhetorical triangle to think about how context shapes a particular text, historical context, contemporary issues, all of that, of course, influences how a text is created. So thinking about this excerpt from Silent Spring, the speaker, as we mentioned, the writer of this text is Rachel Carson. She was a scientist, she was a conservationist, and she was a journalist. So all of those elements of her ethos, of her authority, she brings into this text. The work itself was actually first serialized in the New Yorker before being published as a book. And it was a really important book. It was sort of a watershed moment in the conservation movement. Even President Kennedy at the time read it and gave it credit for changing how he viewed this issues related to the environment. And it was one of the main forces behind the banning of the chemical DDT, which was shown to be particularly harmful to wildlife. So the audience for her, when it was serialized, would have been the general American public, traditional readers of the New Yorker, probably being those who are educated, people who are obviously interested in this subject matter, and then also certainly politicians and policymakers, because the main goal for this work was to change people's thinking and to, in changing their thinking, then to influence political change and policy change. So the subject matter she deals with, the relationship between humans and the environment, use of pesticides, the concept of ecosystems and how humans are a part of those ecosystems, and also citizens' right to know, their right to know the kinds of chemicals and things that are being used around them that may influence their own health. So our first step, as always, is to take a look at this passage that we're analyzing and that we're really looking at closely. So I'm going to pause the video for a moment so that you can also pause the video and read over this particular passage to make sure that you understand what Carson is saying in general here. Okay, so we've had a chance to read the passage, and now we want to look at those overall features, right? Make sure that we understand her purpose here, the mood, the tone, and her position. So getting to those points, what I wrote down, which isn't to say that it's the only answer, because as we've indicated with the S in parentheses, there could be more than one answer. The purpose of this particular passage, I said is to convince people to think about these issues and ultimately to pass laws that restrict pesticide use for the sake of the environment and human health. I said that her mood is impassioned, urgent, perhaps even, and that her tone, certainly toward people who use these chemicals or overuse these chemicals, I should say, not use them, just overuse them or use them, what's the word, irresponsibly, would be critical. Admonishing, I think, is another word that would fit. And even to the general public, the beginning of this passage, have we fallen into a mesmerized state that makes us accept as inevitable that which is inferior or detrimental, really speaking about society in general. So this sort of chastisement of the general public for accepting what is being done to the environment and the types of the ways that people are using these chemicals. And then her position, of course, would be that we need to be more careful. We need to cut back or reduce the amount of chemicals that are used in the environment. So our next step would be to take a look, actually to sort of break apart this passage and look at how Carson actually conveys those overall features. So we're looking at her argument. We're also taking a look at her style. And style is important when it comes to persuading people. We can use our graphic organizer to collect our thoughts and turn them into something that looks more like rhetorical analysis in sentence, paragraph, or essay form. So let's go then to our passage. Okay, so we've got that here. And as I mentioned, she begins by, or I shouldn't say she begins, this particular excerpt refers to we, meaning all of society. She wrote this for a general audience, although again, she's certainly hoping to persuade policymakers, people in power who can change the law. So we have fallen into a mesmerized state. So this word choice, mesmerized, I think is important. It implies that that we're not thinking logically, that we've fallen under some sort of spell, that perhaps there's an implication of being tricked, or at least thought to believe that something is safe when it's not. So that makes us accept as inevitable that which is inferior or detrimental, as though having lost the will or the vision to demand that which is good. So this is posed as a rhetorical question. She wants us to consider our own way of thinking in this matter and to really question our own assumptions and of course, change our way of thinking. Such thinking, in the words of ecologist Paul Shepard, and she uses an expert's statement here for quite a bit of this passage, actually. And I think that's important. I think the fact that she mentions he's an ecologist provides or lends this argument credibility. It's another person from the scientific community who is sounding the alarm, just as she is. So that use of an outside source or an expert lends her own argument more credibility. And she uses his questions, his rhetorical questions, as a way to go into her next point, right? Yet such a world is pressed upon us. And I think it's interesting that she uses that word or that phrase, pressed upon us. Not forced upon us, not put upon us, but I think that term pressed gives that implication of pressure, that we feel pressure and that there's a physical consequence to what's being done. The next sentence we're actually going to look at in our graphic organizer, so I'm going to skip that for the moment. We're going to come back to that. On every hand, there's evidence. We see her repeat the word hand again later, and I think that's interesting because she's drawing our attention to what we do with our hands and how those hands are, they represent our actions. Those hands represent our actions. So she says there is evidence, right, that those engaged in spraying operations exercise a ruthless power. That word ruthless, really getting at her criticism, her condemnation of people who use these kinds of chemicals without care or concern for whatever may die in its path, right? And then we have another scientist or a member from the scientific community. So again, adding to the logic, to the authority of her own argument by citing other experts on this matter. The most flagrant abuses go unchecked in both state and federal agencies. So looking at word choice and tone again. And then at the very end of this excerpt, she says, "It is not my contention that chemical insecticides must never be used." So she clarifies her own position. It's a bit of a concession, right? She's saying, I'm not saying never, ever, ever in any circumstance. So that's a concession. But then she says, she provides her refutation. She says, I do contend that we have put, and it's interesting that she says we at this moment, there's blame, right? There's blame here that's shared among all members of society. She doesn't say they have done it, you have done it, but it's this sort of group societal blame. Have put poisonous and biologically potent chemicals indiscriminately into the hands of persons largely or wholly ignorant of their potentials for harm. So this is important too, this indiscriminately, without care, without concern. And we have subjected enormous numbers of people to contact with these poisons without their consent and often without their knowledge. So there's this parallelism here at the end, and it's important that these words in both phrases, consent, knowledge, are at the end of those phrases. It draws our attention to them. And then that repetition of the word without really emphasizes the fact that people don't know what's going on, and they aren't agreeing to it explicitly. Okay, so let's come back here and let's go to our graphic organizer. And with our graphic organizer, we're looking at a particular quotation. We're putting it into our own words so that we have a better understanding of the meaning. We're looking at the rhetorical, making sure we can identify the strategies or style elements that are being used, and then finally bringing that to the effect or function. So the quotation I chose to take a look at more closely is the line where she writes, "The crusade to create a chemically sterile, insect-free world seems to have engendered a fanatic zeal on the part of many specialists and most of the so-called control agencies." So that part, that was the second sentence of the second paragraph from this excerpt. My way of putting this into my own words, I said, the mission to get rid of bugs and pests has created a crazy one-mindedness in specialists and control agencies who really aren't controlling anything. So that was the way I worded it. I said that, or identified her use of diction, alliteration, and sarcasm. And I said the religious word choice makes the use of these chemicals sound like a passion rather than a logical decision. So now I want to take all these thoughts and put them into something that's more prosaic. And so this is what I came up with. I said, Carson criticizes specialists and so-called control agencies, so pulling those words from the quote, with religiously charged diction. She calls their work a crusade. So again, I'm using very specific evidence from the text here. I'm not quoting, again, the whole sentence, but I'm really trying to get at my understanding of what she's doing and why she's doing it. That's the bulk of my analysis. and I'm pulling out those specific pieces that I need to use as support. So she calls their work a crusade and their approach as fanatical. And actually, that was my mistake. She does not use the term fanatical. She just uses the term fantic. So I think, so there, we'll fix that. Apologies. Both words imply these groups are on a single-minded mission, no matter the cost. Such an emotion-laden, zealous response is unscientific and against principles of logic, which Carson herself relies on in this argument. Okay, so I've used my evidence to support my interpretation of what she's doing and why she's doing it. I've made comments on the effect of specific word choice and that connection to the whole, and to the techniques that Carson uses to develop her position. So I could continue, right, filling out my graphic organizer, writing this analysis, and I could respond to something or respond to a prompt such as, in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical strategies Carson uses to convey her attitude toward the use of chemicals and pesticides. So, all right, well, I want to thank you for your time today. As always, please keep up the hard work. We're very proud of your ability to tackle this kind of information and tackle this kind of writing. And as always, we say, fare thee well, young scholars.